get a real thrill if you learn some blade skill. So that's why today we'll dive a little bit deeper into sword and buckler from 133 Walpurgis. Hello everyone, Lauren here, and today we're going back to our sword and buckler. Here I am trying to make the most use of the space as we get more arming sword details, because I know you like swords. People are always excited to talk about swords, to learn more about swords. So we're going to look at some 133 Walpurgis. We're going to understand some basic concepts of sword fighting, start looking at developing some of those skills. So one of the things we want to do is understand sword and buckler, their unit. And in this manual, what we're discussing, it means fighting other people with sword and buckler. So a lot of it could be seen as sport fencing practice, or maybe it is self-defense against other people with swords in when you're traveling or in the streets, which we know that in some places gets to be frowned upon, more than frowned upon. Laws passed against. Don't carry a sword because we don't want you fighting in the streets. Anyway, sword and a buckler. Well, let's get into it. And the first thing we should learn, because it's the first thing the manual talks about, are what we call custodia e contraria. Basically our guards and counterguards. Okay, I'm going to run through them real quick. First of all, sword held in hand. I like a little bit of space between my hand and the guard. And know that your grip can change. Hammer grip, handshake grip. You can move your thumb a little bit so that you can better manipulate the sword. You don't just hold it tight. That's something that's important. If you're squeezing it tight, you're just going to tire out your arm really fast. Anyway, into our custodia. Our first one is sub brachia. So here I am, right foot forward. I'm on the balls of my feet. You'll notice that it's a little different, my footwork for sword and buckler, than it would be for 15th, 16th century longsword, for example, or other techniques. I've got the buckler in a bit. I've got the sword under my arm. The quillen is almost into my armpit. The long edge is facing up. So if you can see my hand, knuckles are up. The long edge of the sword is up. This is a good way to be coiled up, ready to spring forth, to attack, to take care of the opposing blade, and then move on to the next part of your technique. Second, we have humero dextrale. The buckler is out, the sword is above the right shoulder, and this is called right shoulder. There's also sinestro, left. So the sword is over the left shoulder. Buckler comes back in a bit, not all the way out. Sword is ready. So you have right shoulder, you can launch a strong attack from left shoulder, weak side attack. It depends on where your opponent is defending in their contraria, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Number 4 is capita. I've got the buckler in, I've got the sword above my head. It's really only a few things you can do that are effective, but it does leave you a bit open. There aren't a lot of plays in the manual that look to capita as your start point, as your starting guard for your attacks, but it's in there. And so just knowing how to use it, how to stand, got a relatively wide stance, the back foot's usually up, you're ready to spring forward. Number 5, dextrale latere. I like to do this with left foot forward, but you can do it with right foot forward as well. You've got the sword kind of lateral, not quite a tail guard all the way behind you, but it's hard to tell because in the manual, A, this image is partly ruined, and B, it's very two-dimensional, and they don't have any foreshortening so that you can really see how the sword is angled. So it kind of looks like it's off to the back, and you've got the buckler in front. And that means I can launch a good rising cut, and I can attack. 6, pectora, the chest. Point just past the buckler if my right foot is forward in this guard. If I change, I sometimes like to have left foot forward. Back a bit here. Okay. And that means that I can kind of move the buckler in front, because now I can extend a little bit further out and hide the point. And then when I thrust, surprise from behind my buckler. But if you have right foot forward, the point is going to be in front. And I can still do that move. And of course your buckler is out. And finally, we have Langot, the long point. So I've got my sword out front. There's a low long point. Buckler is helping to protect. There's also a high long point. See, a low long point, a high long point. And all of the images in the manual are done from side on. So now I will do them really quick. I'll cycle through so that we can see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Switch around so that we can see 5, 6, and 7. There we go. Haven't hit the ceiling yet today. There's still time. Okay. Now there are a few other guard positions, a few other custodia that you could launch attacks from, make moves from. For example, Krücke, the crutch, which could also be done like that. There's also Walpurgis has a guard where the sword is kept in and the buckler is here, and she kind of looks like this in the manual. So you could be ready to go, sword in, and just attack like that. And you'll notice my buckler is always moving to meet the sword. That's one thing that we always have to be conscious about in our I.33 Walpurgis system, is that the buckler is always protecting the hand and forearm. It is always moving around, because if it's not in place and you come to bind my sword, I'll cut into your arm real quick. And if you get caught in your sword arm, you can't hold your sword. Fight over. Okay. So the opposite then, but not opposite, contraria, counters. So your counter guards start off with half shield. And so in the manual we have a half shield. Don't put your buckler, you can put your buckler out like this, but angle it a little bit. I find that's a bit more helpful. Get a little bit more arm coverage. You don't want someone trying to sneak around. You want to deter people from ideas before they try them, essentially. So here I am, half shield. Because I've got my shield and sword halfway up here, I'm ready to defend. There are other ones like fiddlebow. There are various ways to defend with your half shield. There are various ways to put your feet for it. We won't dig too deep because we want to make it a shorter video. I want you to just get to our next concept, which means if we've got someone in our contraria, they're in our counter guard, waiting for an attack. The point is out there. They're saying, if you want to fight me, you have to deal with my sword. If you just try to attack me, you're going to run right onto my sword. I'm going to stab you. And you're right there. So you need to deal with the sword. And a lot of what I.33 is about. Binds. What does that mean? Well, a bind is when your blade moves to control the opposing blade. We've talked about that in some of our basics concept videos. So there are overbinds and underbinds in the system. And when I overbind, my sword is on top. When I underbind, my sword is coming from the bottom. That is the most basic way to explain it. You'll look at one and say, is that over or under? And you have to kind of think where your sword is controlling, because I can't have my sword angled like this and be underbound, because I'm under versus over. So it really depends on where your crossguard is. Where's the hilt of your sword? And if it's turning upward, not past the blade, but you can easily clear it upward, it's fine. If it's going to end it upward, if you moved it, it would be under the blade, and that's an underbind. And from these positions of overbind and underbind, you then move to your next step in the play in order to attack the opponent. The manual will emphasize that overbinds are better, so it's better to bind over than to bind under. And mutatio, or change, means if I am bound under the opposing blade, I want to change over. So mutatio means a change. So I could be out there I could then move the sword blade around. In later terms, we might call this a bit of a disengage. Okay. Ooh. Hip's a little stiff today. That happens. So, what can you do from these positions? Okay, so I have the opposing sword. Here I go. I attack. I bound. I want to attack my opponent, and I bound the sword, and I'm bound over top. Well, one thing that's really good is now the buckler's going to leave the sword and perform what we call shield slack, shield strike. It's going to punch into the opposing blade, and then I can then turn the blade 90 degrees and into the opposing face with a rising cut. So shield slack is one of the big things. You are going to use the buckler to control the opposing blade. You're not going to leave with your sword, maybe a tenth of a second or so, but you're really keeping your sword on the opposing blade until you've got the buckler moving to block that sword. Then you can launch your attack with the sword. So the buckler and the sword are two different things doing two different processes at the same time. And that's what the real trick of learning sword and buckler is that you're learning that I'm moving the buckler, I'm turning it, I'm around, where's my hand, how am I holding it? Now I'm just kind of playing around, but I'm showing you that the buckler is going to cross over at times. It's going to be symmetrical. It could mean that your hand is turned upside down, right side up. And it takes a lot of practice. So combining that with your footwork, which is a bit more on the balls of your feet in this system than in later systems, right? And then the next thing is that when you're doing these moves, if you're already close enough, you don't have to step forward again. I might be in my bind, and my opponent might be close enough that all I'm going to do when I shield strike is I'm just going to lean forward a bit. I'm still going to try and keep my weight fairly evenly distributed, but it's tricky because I'm hip hinging. I'm leaning at the waist to attack, but my feet are not going to move forward. So remember, we have the distance. If I'm already in the distance, I may just have to cover a little bit, just a few inches, and I'm already bound up on the sword. I can just lean. So here I am, lean, and I got just that extra little bit of distance, that 10 to 15 centimeters, that 5 or 6 inches that I need maybe, just by leaning forward. And again, if you're more on the balls of your feet in this system, it enables you to hip hinge, but you still can maintain your fairly well distributed balance so that you're not too far forward, that you're just leaning and extending. So that's something that's a little tricky to master and does require a little more practice as well. So now, not only are you looking after a sword doing one thing, and a buckler suddenly doing something different, and now your body has to do something different just to reach in a little bit so that you can land your attack. There are a lot of components. And we'll see why someone made a manual, perhaps. Might be a good theory that there's a lot of information that you need to teach someone. So someone wrote it down. Most likely 133 is not the first fighting manual. This is an opinion from Jeffrey Forgang, I believe, from a seminar I did over the weekend, that, you wouldn't just have this level of detail up here. So there are probably manuals that are lost that came before that. Probably writings, probably a few images, something simpler that comes before we get to 133. So we know it's a more complex system. And in the manual, it talks about the special moves used by the priest and his students. So we're talking about techniques that aren't common to everyone else, but they are more, let's say, a master class, that this priest knows special sneaky moves and he wants to teach it. However, for us, that's our base set. Our special sneaky moves of the priest and his students are going to be what we use. Now there are other guards and other positions, but what we can do is just briefly talk about ones we know. We cut into the opposing blade, we attack. Notice I'm rotating the buckler, I'm doing a shield strike. There could be a stick slack or a thrust strike, so I'm thrusting and I'm striking at the same time so that I'm controlling that opposing blade and I'm thrusting. Again, the nukin is that rising cut to the face. I can have a lot of downward cuts. I can have rising cuts as well. There are moves where from the bind I might be able to then cut up. There's not a lot of cutting action to the legs. Remember, you can lean forward, you can step back and lean out to defend. You're hip hinging. So far, a normal pose is here. Your hip hinging is allowing you to move forward, but you notice my legs aren't moving that much. I'm not really getting a lot of movement in that front leg. So there's just a few details of sword and buckler as a system. I won't make the video too long, but just to give you an idea that there's a lot of technique that go into using these two things. It's not just attack, defend, attack, defend. It doesn't quite work that way. It's attack with the buckler already defending, defend with the buckler there to support, maybe a counterattack. There's also wrestling and grappling moves in this because all the best systems have wrestling and grappling moves. If there's no wrestling and grappling, it's not as much fun. Without another person, I can't really show those. There are images in the manual for it. Of course, you can come down, bind the opposing swords, you kind of step to the side. Something we're talking about triangle steps. There will be a lot of offline stepping as well because you're trying to control that distance. If I'm already too close and the opposing sword is a threat to me, 1, 2. Remember from our previous videos, this is my line. I'm changing the line that I'm on, and I'm doing that triangle step. So here I am, 1, 2. So I've made kind of this triangle from where I was, and I'm changing the line to attack. That also allows me to come in, grab the opposing sword, thrust. I can come around, and I'm really doing a number of things to make sure that I'm controlling the opponent's sword and buckler to open a nice clear line for my attack, whichever one it's going to be. So that's just a little bit more detail on how sword and buckler works. We'll do more videos about that, but there are a whole bunch of other things to talk about as well coming up. I want to talk about quarterstaff. I want to do some stuff about daggers. I want to do more stuff about armor, and particularly protecting your head. But we'll get to that. For today, I just want to say thanks very much for watching. Do remember, like, subscribe, notification, tell your friends, share on social media, all those Facebook things that we all like to tell you to do at the end of our videos. And I hope that you have a fantastic day.